Last episode, we took this transfer case apart and started cleaning it up. This time, we'll jump right into checking out our damaged parts and trying to find replacements. First up is the gasket and seal kit we got to do this rebuild. It was surprisingly cheap and pretty complete, and even included some seals that I have no idea what they're for. I can only assume there are different variants of some of the seals. And of course, we also have to replace that broken bearing retaining ring. Through a dealership, you can supposedly get a retaining ring that definitely has a better heat treating on it. What we ended up with was this small parts kit off of eBay, which included retaining rings and some extra parts we also needed. These are supposed to be improved higher strength retaining rings, but I suppose only time will tell. It's also possible to get slightly thicker retaining rings, where you can grind out the groove to make more space for the stronger ring, or to make room for two of the thinner clips. For now, we won't be doing any of that, and we'll just be going with the replacement clip. Here's a new range shift fork pad compared to some of the pieces we were able to find of the old ones. But unfortunately, we're going to need different parts, as we won't be able to use those new ones that came in the small parts kit. Finding information about this model transfer case proved very difficult. The two things that basically saved me were the parts numbers and diagrams on gmpartsdirect.com, as well as this design change info service document that I was eventually able to come across. Before finding these documents, it was proving very difficult to get the part numbers I needed. A few years after my 2007 model truck was made, there were some design changes to the transfer case to fix some known issues. They changed the front output shaft and added a deflector in front of the seal, probably to help keep the seal from rusting to the output shaft like ours did. The design of the range fork was also changed, as well as the range fork pads and range clutch hub. There were also some other changes made, such as to the planetary carriers, that made the new models incompatible with the old ones. Since this transfer case is a 2007 model, it has all of the first design parts, including a range fork and pad setup that's supposed to look like this one. Instead, the fork pulled out of our transfer case looks like this. It's clearly been grinding against the range clutch hub and is pretty worn down. Even if we just wanted to replace the plastic pads, it's not an option. They won't even fit in 2 of the 3 slots anymore. So, we got a new range fork for the transfer case. This is the updated design that uses the large 2-piece pads. This updated style of plastic pad locks into the 3 notches in the fork. They also offer a much larger contact surface area. Even though the updated fork fits the range clutch hub we have, we already know the teeth on the range clutch hub are damaged, and a closer examination reveals cracking from heat and fatigue. And then when we take an up-close look at the planetary carrier, unfortunately we notice the same thing. Not only has the surface been scratched up by the range clutch hub, but there are cracks forming around the teeth it locks into. That means this planetary carrier is trashed as well. Before we managed to dig up that design change document, we were kinda blindly guessing with part numbers and accidentally ended up with the second revision planetary carrier and range hub. Clearly, the smaller second design carrier and range hub are not going to work for us. Luckily, we were able to easily return those parts, and eventually we got the right part numbers and ordered this carrier and range hub, which will actually fit in our transfer case. This replacement carrier is the original model and should be exactly the same as the one that originally came with this transfer case. The new range hub is the updated version of the design for the first version of the transfer case. The teeth seem to have a slightly different design, and the surface the range fork pads ride on is a little bit wider. But perhaps most importantly, it easily engages and disengages on the carrier. For the sake of comparison, here are the old, damaged parts. It's pretty safe to say that the grinding noise was from these 2 parts attempting to mesh together and failing. Between the rear bearing letting the shaft walk forward and the missing fork pads, everything must have been able to shift forward enough to touch these 2 together and force the transfer case halfway into neutral. And speaking of the rear output shaft bearing, here it is again. The looseness in this bearing letting the rear output shaft move around is what ended up causing most of the major issues. Since the vehicle speed sensor reluctor wheel could move around in a way it's not supposed to, it gave all kinds of weird readings and the computer didn't know what to do. The output shaft moving in a weird way and binding, probably on that range hub, is what caused the clunk in reverse. As for what actually failed first, I'm not completely sure. I don't think it was the retaining clip. I think that only cracked from the deformation of the bearing's inner race or the clunking in reverse. If I had to guess, I'd say the plastic pads on the fork failed first, and then either the contamination in the oil caused the rear bearing to fail, or damage caused by the output shaft being hammered in reverse. But either way, we should be replacing all of the problem parts, and with the updated designs, hopefully nothing like this will happen again. Of course, we'll be replacing the rear output shaft bearing, but we need to clean up and check the other 3 main bearings. Once we've sprayed out the bearings with brake clean, we'll dunk them in clean transmission fluid and roll them around a bit. We'll repeat those steps 3 or 4 times and make sure everything feels completely smooth turning in both directions. Just for a quick test of these bearings and for a point of comparison, we'll clamp the outer race in the vise and put the dial indicator against the inner race to measure the axial end play of each one. Both of the front output shaft bearings measured under 10 thousandths. And the same was true for the input shaft bearing. As is the case for our nice new SKF rear output shaft bearing. But somehow the old rear output shaft bearing doesn't quite meet the same grade. Well, anyway, the bearings we'll be using all check out and feel good. But what about our rear output shaft bushing? Well, it's more of a drive shaft bushing, really. Anyway, we got a part number and double checked that the measurements of our bushing matched the one we were ordering. It seemed like everything checked out and we should have the right bushing. Before installing it, we also checked and made sure it fit well on the drive shaft. So we're ready to install the new bushing into the case. We'll use brake cleaner to wipe down the bore one more time and clean the new bushing. Then we'll apply a little bit of thread locking compound onto the outside of the bushing. Of course, bearing retaining compound would also work well here. We'll set the bearing over its bore in the case and we'll use a large washer to get it started. We'll start off going around the edge of the bearing to make sure we're driving it in straight. Then we'll hold a socket over the washer so that we can hammer over the center and push the bushing into the case quickly and easily. And after one last hit, the bushing is flush with its bore and fully installed into the case. We'll make sure to wipe up any excess thread locking compound and then apply just a little bit of transmission fluid to the surface of the bushing so that we can test fit it on the drive shaft. And it's a perfect match. The drive shaft can't wobble like before, but it still rotates easily. So next up, we'll install the new rear output shaft seal. We made sure all the new seals we have matched the old ones before removing them, so everything should install just fine. And after cleaning up the surfaces, we'll once again apply some thread locker. Then we'll set the seal against the case and use this piece from a ball joint puller kit to hammer it in. Once again, we'll take our time to make sure it sets down straight and fits completely flush against the case. And with the seal and bearing in place, we'll move on to another part of assembly. Now that all our parts are clean and we have new retaining clips to install, we can put back together the output shaft assembly. We'll apply some oil to the various parts as we assemble it, and we'll start with the shift mode synchro hub. We'll reinstall the 3 blocking rings one at a time and make sure everything is put together correctly. Except for the 3 tabs, everything should sit about flush with the face of the synchro hub. Then we'll oil the splines on the output shaft and slide on the whole synchro hub assembly. Then add a little oil where this next part will ride. Next up is the chain drive sprocket, which is another part with needle bearings. We sprayed them out with brake clean, and now we'll try to work in some oil to make sure it's not dry on the first start. After repeating this process a few times, we're ready to reinstall it on the output shaft. It should spin freely and easily, and then we can slide on the chain drive sprocket spacer, and we'll make sure the lugs are locked into the sprocket. And then we have the chain drive sprocket retaining ring, and we'll lock that in place using our snap ring pliers. And the sprocket still spins freely as it should. Then we'll reinstall the spring steel ring onto the oil pump. It's pretty straightforward to lift it back into its groove. And we'll make sure the angled end fits into its slot on the oil pump. Then with everything oiled, we'll slide the oil pump onto its splines. And again, make sure it rotates easily. Next up is the speed sensor reluctor wheel. This can be installed in either direction. And after that is the rear output shaft bearing front retaining ring. Once again, we'll use snap ring pliers to install the new clip. Of course, always make sure these retaining rings are completely in their grooves. Now we'll flip to the other side of the shaft to get the shift mode synchro inserts and shift mode synchro sleeve installed. The inserts are just little self-contained units with a spring and detent ball. It can be a little tricky, but we'll need to hold all 3 of them in place at once while we install the synchro sleeve. It's probably easiest to let one fall out and then reinstall it as everything is coming together, and then just give it a few taps and hopefully everything will click into place. And with the synchro sleeve installed, we can see how it works. In the forward position, the case is in 2-wheel drive and the chain drive sprocket spins freely on the shaft. When pushed rearward, the teeth inside the synchro sleeve lock the small set of teeth on the chain drive sprocket to the synchro hub, and the transfer case is in 4-wheel drive. Now we're ready to start assembling components inside the case, but that would be much easier if the case is held in a vertical position. Instead of making an entirely new fixture, what we'll do is modify the one we used to hold our transmission vertical into a fixture that we can bolt the transfer case to. Making this would be a pretty straightforward process, even if you didn't already have some random 2x4s screwed together. And now that we've made a stand, we'll attach it to the front half of the transfer case. To do this, we'll carefully thread in 2 of the adapter studs and persuade it to fit into the stand. We'll just tighten it down to the stand finger tight, it shouldn't be going anywhere. Now that it's on the bench, we have good access to everything, and we can easily reinstall the range internal gear retaining ring. Just like the other rings of this style, we'll start with one end in the groove and then push the whole thing down. And with that fully installed, we'll make sure the input shaft bearing bore is clean, thoroughly oil the bearing, and set it into the bore. In order to press it into place, we'll simply place an extension against the outer race, and as usual, we'll try to press it in straight and keep moving around the perimeter of the bearing. And then once the bearing is fully below the retaining ring groove, we'll use snap ring pliers to install it. And once we double check that the ring is fully in position, we can get ready to install some other parts. First, we'll set up the input shaft and planetary carrier assembly. We'll apply a bit of oil to the rear input shaft thrust washer and drop it into the carrier. Then we'll oil the input shaft, paying special attention to the pilot bearing. And once we've done that, we'll slot it into place in the carrier. And we'll follow it up with the front input shaft thrust washer, the range locking plate, and we'll hold it all together with the range planetary carrier retaining ring. And once again, we'll get one end started and then pry the other end in just a little bit to get it snapped into place. And once we make sure everything rotates freely, it's ready to go into the case. We'll apply extra oil to the gear teeth, gear bearings, and the input shaft bearing mating surface and drop it into place. Everything should fit together easily once the gear teeth mesh. And as usual, we'll make sure everything rotates freely and easily. Next, we'll oil the front input shaft and get its bearings set into place. Then we'll use another handy piece from our ball joint press kit and press the inner race of the bearing down onto the shaft. And once the bearing is fully seated, we'll fit it into the case and install it with a few taps. Then we'll give it a spin and make sure everything turns easily and that the shaft is centered on the bearing. Since everything looks good, we'll add some extra oil to the bearing and get ready to install the internal shift detent lever. And once we work some oil into the needle bearings, we can slot it into place. Then we'll oil our new clutch range hub and drop it into the carrier. And now we're ready to install the output shaft. We'll hold on to the range clutch hub to get those splines seated and then drop it farther in until it's fully seated in the pilot bearing. And again, we'll make sure everything rotates as it should. In order to get the shift mode fork ready to install, we'll remove the old pads from it and install the new plastic pads that came with our small parts kit. The 3 pieces will lock into place on the fork with a firm push. We'll also thoroughly oil the needle bearings inside of this fork. Then we'll get our new range fork ready to install. This fork doesn't have needle bearings, but we'll still make sure everything is thoroughly oiled. These pads don't hold on as tightly, so we'll have to be careful when guiding them into place. We'll start by installing the range fork, which needs to be fitted inside of the range clutch hub. We'll lift up the hub as far as it can go and hold the pads together tightly to the fork, and we'll make sure to guide the steel pin into the shift detent lever. Just make sure to get that pin into the right channel in the detent lever. Then we'll oil the new pads on the shift mode fork and slot it into the synchro sleeve. Just like the other range fork, this one has to be matched up with the shift detent lever. To line things up, we'll start installing the shift fork shaft and make sure the shift mode fork's pin is sitting in this groove in the detent lever. Then we'll line up the shaft with the case and give it one more push to get it fully seated. And with those parts assembled, we'll double check that everything is still working as it should before moving on. And then we'll top it all off with the shift fork spring. And next we're going to be installing the chain and the driven sprocket. We'll start by installing the driven sprocket onto the chain, draping the chain over the drive sprocket, and then to help get things lined up, we'll lift up the output shaft just enough to get it out of the pilot bearing and allow it some wiggle room. Then we'll get the splines lined up and drop the driven sprocket onto the front output shaft. And now that most of the case is together, we can give it a full run through. Here we have 2-wheel drive high, and 4-wheel drive high, and neutral, and it's a little hard to see just looking inside the transfer case, but this is for low. So next, we'll reinstall our oil pump pickup tube with a new O-ring on it. And once it's fully installed in the pump, we can clip the screen end of it into the case. And we'll apply some oil to the chain-driven sprocket spacer and install it to the front output shaft. Make sure to install the waved spring as well. Next, we'll work on getting our rear output shaft bearing installed. The new bearing came with a retaining clip installed on it, so first we'll remove that. Then we'll thoroughly oil it, including the inner surface of the inner race, and slide it over the output shaft with the notch for the retaining ring facing the rear. To be honest, it would be best to do this step before the output shaft was installed for the sake of the other bearings. But what we'll do is support the input shaft with a 2x4 to raise it up a little bit and prevent the bearings from being hammered on. We ended up using yet another piece from that ball joint press set to make it easier to direct force to the inner race without risk of hitting the outer race. Pretty soon, the bearing is fully installed, and we can check on this by looking at that retaining ring groove. It's flush with the edge of the bearing, which means we're ready to install a ring and lock it in place. We've been using the new rings wherever possible, and of course, since this one broke, we have a new ring for it. We'll double check that it's fully installed, and then we can move on. Onto the back of the case, we'll oil up the rear front output shaft bearing and get it pressed in. And once that's flush against the case, we'll wipe up as much of the excess oil from the top half as possible, and then clean the sealing surfaces of each case half and go for a test fit. We want to make sure everything will still line up and we can still get that rear output shaft bearing in place in the back of the case. Once everything is aligned, we'll give it a few taps to get the case halves flush. Everything checks out, and the groove in the bearing matches the retaining ring groove in the case. So we'll go ahead and separate the case halves again and get ready for final assembly. For final assembly, we need to reinstall that rear bearing retaining ring into the case. Because of its specialized design, we're using the original retaining ring and not the one that came with the new bearing. And with freshly cleaned sealing surfaces, we'll go ahead and apply our sealer. We'll use Permatex Ultra Gray, which is made for applications like this, where you're sealing together two rigid elements with a fair amount of torque. You'll want to lay a nice, even 1/8" bead around the perimeter of the case. Tightening down the case halves will really flatten this stuff out, so you don't want to use too much. Since the oil pump pickup screen is right next to that sealing surface, using too much can end up clogging it and destroy the transfer case. It's definitely not necessary to go around the outsides of the bolt holes, but we'll do it anyway just for kicks. And so, with our masterpiece completed, we're ready to fit the two halves of the case together for good. We'll do one last check to make sure we don't have any extra pieces, and then fit everything together once again. And once the case halves are flush all the way around, there's one more thing we'll do before bolting them together. We need to get the rear output shaft bearing retaining ring around the outside of the bearing. This is difficult to do and pretty much impossible to film. It's hard enough to see anything going on at all. The best advice I can give is to prop up the input shaft pretty far so that the output shaft is held up against the ring. Then, theoretically, all you have to do is spread the ring open and the bearing will fall into place. However, it is one of those things that's easier said than done. Really, the main obstacle was that these proto snap ring pliers, which are the ones that fit the best in there, can't be closed far enough to hold onto the ring in its relaxed position. What ended up working was using two large flathead screwdrivers to get the ring started onto the bearing, so the ring is around the bearing but it's still not in the groove. To take care of this, we'll remove the 2x4 out from under the input shaft and give the output shaft a few gentle taps with the rubber mallet. And there we are. We'll double check that it's fully in the groove, but it seems like that output shaft bearing retainer is good to go. So now, we'll begin bolting the case together. We'll start with this bolt that holds on this harness bracket, and once all the bolts are in place, we'll go around and snug them all down. Then we'll go around the case, tightening the bolts in a crisscross pattern until finally torquing them all down to spec. And once they've all been tightened, we'll go around one more time and make sure they're all good. Now that the case is back together, we need it flat on the bench, so we'll remove it from our stand. We'll also unthread the two studs we were using to hold it to the stand, since we'll want to Loctite in all the studs. Now we'll work on getting the input shaft front bearing retainer installed. First, we'll pull the input shaft all the way forward so that we can get to the groove. We'll open up the ring with our snap ring pliers and get it started on the input shaft. We need to push the ring all the way back into its groove without moving the input shaft with it. So we'll hold it forward as we guide the ring back, and once it gets started in the groove, we'll give it a push on both sides to make sure it's fully seated. Before we install these seals, we'll give everything another check to make sure it's still working. Seems to be working fine, so we'll move on. We'll apply oil to the input shaft as well as the seal bore. Since this is a totally rubber seal, we won't use any retaining compound, we'll just add a little oil and press it into place. We'll install the new one in the same direction the old one was installed in. We'll push it in as far as we can get it by hand, and then use a piece from that ball joint kit and give it a few taps. And with the seal a little bit below flush, we'll call it fully installed. And again, we'll make sure that the input shaft still turns easily. And next, we have the front output shaft seal. Same deal for this seal, since the outside edge is rubber, we'll just use oil to install it. We considered using anti-seize on that inner steel seal to help keep it from rusting to the output shaft, but we were worried about it contaminating the oil, so we'll just make sure it's oiled. We'll use a socket extension against the inner and outer steel parts of the seal in order to get it fully seated. And once it is, everything turns nice and easily. The seal was already greased, but we'll add a little bit of oil in between the two sections of it just for kicks. We'll also use a little bit of oil to help install our new access hole plugs. These will just pop into place. And then we have the vehicle speed sensor. We'll remove the old O-ring, oil a new one, and install it onto the sensor. Then we'll get that threaded in and torqued to spec. Well, actually I couldn't find a spec for that at the time, so we'll just go ahead and tighten it down. And then we'll repeat that same process for the shift control switch assembly. Remove the old O-ring, install a new one, install into case, and then tighten down. It was when getting the O-rings for these parts that we realized we actually did have a new seal for the shift lever. It had just cleverly disguised itself as a black O-ring. It would have been easier to remove the seal before the D10 shift lever was installed, but oh well. We'll take this all, hammer it into the seal, and twist the whole thing out. And once it's far enough out, we can just grab it with pliers and remove the seal. We'll clean the seal bore about as well as we can using a Q-tip and a paper towel. Then we'll oil the new seal and get it in place on the case. Then we'll use a socket to press the seal in. The inner lip was getting caught on the shoulder of that detent lever, so we just used a pick to push it all into place before driving the seal home. We'll make sure the detent lever moves freely in the seal and the seal doesn't try to pop out before we install the shift lever. Since everything seems good, we'll put the external shift lever in place. Then we'll apply some medium strength thread locker to the bolt, thread it in, and tighten it down. Then we'll tip the transfer case up onto its side so that we can install the shift detent assembly. We'll start by removing the old O-ring from the shift detent plug. We'll install a new oiled O-ring, oil the case bore and drop in the shift detent plunger and spring, and then thread in the shift detent plug. Then we'll tighten it down. We'll also install the fill and drain plugs, but just finger tight. At this point, the transfer case is fully sealed and could be filled, but we'll wait until it's in the vehicle to get the level just right. And, well, that's about it. But before we end this episode, we'll give the transfer case one last function test. To make this easier to see, we've stuck masking tape flags on each of the shafts. First, we have two-wheel drive high. The input shaft and rear output shaft are connected, and there's no gear reduction. Then we'll shift into four-wheel high. Now the input shaft is connected to both output shafts, but there's still no gear reduction. Now we'll move the shifter in the opposite direction. First, we're back to two-wheel high. From there, we can shift it into neutral. The input shaft is the only one turning. It is disconnected from the two output shafts. And last but not least, we'll shift it into four-wheel low. The input shaft is connected to both output shafts again, but this time there's gear reduction between them. This particular transfer case offers a 2.68 to 1 gear reduction, meaning it takes 2.68 turns of the input shaft to turn the output shafts one time. Everything seems to be working just as it should. So we'll officially call this transfer case rebuilt. There's still more for us to do, like bolting the transmission and transfer case back together and, of course, installing it in the truck, but we'll handle that in the next episode. And then we can install the rear retaining ring for the first we gotta find one that fits.